It is really remarkable how wonderfully God has arranged all the biblical spring feasts, and how they got a new meaning in the year of Jesus' death. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus was crucified on the day when the Passover lambs were slaughtered, on Nisan 14. And according to the other Gospels, it was one day later, on the 15th. I explain in detail that the Gospels do not contradict each other, but complement each other in a wonderful way by showing different perspectives. Jesus ate the Passover meal and died at the hour when the other Passover lambs were being sacrificed. There are many Passover customs that point prophetically to Jesus. Today, I will only look at time-related aspects. The Passover is also known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was to take place in the first month of each year. The first month was initially called Abib or Aviv, depending on the translation. The name Nisan was later used in reference to the Babylonian calendar. By the way, the first day of the seventh month is celebrated as New Year's Day. In the Bible, this day is not called New Year's Day, but the Feast of Trumpets. Celebrating the new year in fall can be understood as follows. The biblical day begins and ends at sunset. However, the hours of the day are not counted from sunset, but from sunrise. The first hour of the day begins early in the morning at sunrise. The seventh begins at noon, when the sun is at its highest point, and the 12th hour ends at sunset. Similarly, the year begins in fall, what corresponds to sunset, followed by winter, and the first month begins in spring, and that corresponds to the first hour. Now back to the Passover. On the 10th day of the first month, a lamb without blemish should be taken for each family. It was then sacrificed at twilight at Passover on the 14th. In Hebrew, it is written more specifically that it should be killed between or in the midst of the two evenings. To understand this unusual timing, let me share some background information with you. The hours of the day are divided into two periods. The morning period spans the first 6 hours, and the evening period the other 6. This is the time from the 7th to the 12th hour. The time between the two evenings is the middle between the end of the morning period at noon and the evening itself. So it's in the middle of the afternoon, towards the end of the 9th hour. In the evening, the lamb was eaten with bitter herbs, on the so-called Seder evening. The Hebrew word Seder means order, because the procedure of this festive meal is regulated by many rituals. From the 15th to the 21st of the month, it was forbidden to eat leavened bread. And on both the 15th and the 21st, one was not allowed to work, and a holy assembly had to be held. Let's look at what happened in the year when Jesus died. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus came to Bethany 6 days before the Passover. Does Passover refer to the day on which the lambs were slaughtered, or to the days that followed, on which no leavened bread was allowed to be eaten? To answer this question, let's consider that it is written in John 19:14 that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation of the Passover. A preparation day is the day immediately before a non-working day. So it's the day on which preparations are made for the feast day. The day of preparation of the Passover is therefore Nisan 14, because work was not allowed on Nisan 15. So Passover refers to the first day of rest of the Passover feast, which is on the 15th. Since Jesus came to Bethany 6 days earlier, it must have been on the 9th. The next day, on the 10th, Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. The people cheered him as he sat on a donkey that was walking on cloaks and branches of palm trees. Before the feast of the Passover, Jesus had supper with his disciples. On this occasion, he washed their feet. He identified his betrayer. He taught various things and said the high priestly prayer. Then he was arrested and questioned by the high priest. Early in the morning, Jesus was led to the governor's headquarters. The Jews themselves did not enter that place, so that they would not be defiled but could eat the Passover. Because if someone was unclean, they were not allowed to celebrate the Passover. This shows that for the council, and therefore also for the general population of the Jews, it was on Nisan 14. The author of this gospel agreed with this and called this day the day of preparation of the Passover. Jesus was crucified and buried on this day of preparation for a Sabbath that was a high day. The high day was the first day of unleavened bread, which fell on the weekly Sabbath, as I will show you later. It is interesting that the Gospel, according to John, does not say that Jesus ate the Passover meal, and there's also no reference to the institution of the Lord's Supper. This is logical because the Passover lambs had to be slaughtered on Nisan 14, while Jesus was being crucified. Accordingly, no Passover meal should have been eaten the day before. Let's look at the events according to the other Gospels. The Gospel according to Mark contains most of the details about the timeline. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went out to Bethany at evening. The following day he left it again and went to the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus taught there, and towards evening he left the city. The next morning he went back to the temple in Jerusalem, where they tried to trap him in his talk. Jesus was therefore tested to see whether he was really without guilt and without sin. Just as a Passover lamb was examined from Nisan 10 to 14 in order to see whether it was really without blemish. Jesus then went to the Mount of Olives, and there he gave his end-time sermon. And that was 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. As I just explained, the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on Nisan 15, so it took place on Nisan 13. Matthew mentioned in his Gospel that Jesus said on this occasion, on the Mount of Olives, that the Passover was in 2 days, and that he would then be delivered up to be crucified. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb. This translation is somewhat misleading, because one might think that the first day of unleavened bread could refer to Nisan 15. The Greek adjective protos, translated here as first, also means most important or before. In John chapter 1, verses 15 and 30, This word is used by John the Baptist, saying that Jesus had been before him. So this refers to the most important day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the day before when the lambs were sacrificed, which is Nisan 14. On that day, Jesus had the Passover lamb prepared for himself and his disciples, and they ate it in the evening. Jesus himself called this evening meal Passover. According to his understanding, it must have been the evening of Nisan 14, when he instituted the Lord's Supper. So I cannot follow the theory that Jesus celebrated something similar with his disciples the day before the actual Passover, so that his disciples could then take the Passover with their families the following day. After the Passover meal, Jesus was arrested that very night in the Garden of Gethsemane. Early in the morning, Jesus was interrogated by the whole council and crucified at the 3rd hour. From the 6th to the 9th hour there was darkness, and then Jesus died. And that was exactly at the time when the other Passover lambs were slaughtered, at the 9th hour. Jesus was laid in the tomb on the day of preparation. This preparation day refers to the preparation day for the weekly Sabbath, because the preparation day for the Passover had already been one day earlier. Let's compare the Gospels. I summarize the events in this table. The first line shows the date according to the council, the common people of the Jews, and the Gospel of John. The Passover lambs were taken on Nisan 10 and killed on the 14th. In the second line are the dates according to Jesus' understanding, as described in the other three Gospels. Jesus was coming to Jerusalem on the very day when the Passover lambs were taken. He was tested in Jerusalem on the following days and celebrated his last Passover meal with the disciples on the evening before his crucifixion. As I explained, Jesus was laid in the tomb on the day of preparation before the weekly Sabbath. The Sabbath, which is Saturday, is the 7th day of the week. So Jesus died on the 6th day, which is Friday. This implies that he entered Jerusalem on the 2nd day of the week, so not on Palm Sunday, but on Monday. So what's the correct date of Jesus' death? Nisan 14 or 15? The astonishing answer is both dates are correct. But before I confuse you even more, let me give you some background on the biblical calendar. A biblical month is a lunar month because God made the moon to mark the seasons. The Hebrew word Kodesh can mean both month and new moon, and then denotes the first day of the month. If the new moon is seen in the evening, then the next day is the new moon day, and therefore the first day of the next month, the so-called head of the month. In the middle of the month there is a full moon, and towards the end the moon is not visible at all. At the end of the month, in the evening, the people kept watch and then reported to the council the next morning when they had seen the new moon. It was then up to the council to proclaim the new month according to the testimony of the witnesses. However, if the month had already lasted 30 days, the next day was declared the first day of the next month, even if the new moon had not yet been seen due to the clouds. It could also happen that for several months it was so cloudy that it was impossible to see the new moon. This could have meant that there could have been many consecutive months with 30 days, and then the new moon could have been seen already on the 28th day, for example. To avoid this, the council could declare the new moon after 29 days in such cases, even though the new moon had not yet been seen. This means that a month always has 29 or 30 days, because, in average, the phases of the moon are 29.53 days long. Most years have 12 months, and every 2 to 3 years there's a leap year which is 13 months long. This ensures that the first month of Nisan is always in spring. Not all Jews agreed with the council's decision, and also today not all follow the calendar as published by the rabbis in Israel. At least since the 4th century, it has been customary to shift the start of the month, if necessary, so that in particular the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, does not fall on a Friday or Sunday. This is because several Jews want to avoid having to observe 2 consecutive days of rest, whereas others strictly follow the astronomical dates. Regarding leap years, there is a rule that over a period of 19 years, the 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and 19th year should be a leap year. On the other hand, there are Jews who only decide towards the end of the year in spring whether the current year is a leap year or not, depending on how far the grain in Israel has already ripened. The writers of the Gospels obviously had a different understanding of when the month had begun. For Jesus, the month had begun 1 day earlier than for the others. Jesus certainly ate the Passover meal on the evening of Nisan 14. Otherwise, he would have violated the Mosaic law and would have sinned. It was certainly easy for our Heavenly Father to show Jesus the new moon 1 day earlier. It is also plausible that Jesus did not agree with the council's decision for another reason. God arranged it in such a way that the council declared the beginning of the month 1 day later than Jesus. This made it possible for Jesus to celebrate the Passover meal with his disciples, what he earnestly desired, and also to institute the Lord's Supper before he died as our Passover lamb, precisely at the time when the Jews were sacrificing their Passover lambs. Let's come back to the question of whether Jesus was crucified on Nisan 14 or 15. According to the calendar of the council, he was crucified on Nisan 14, and according to Jesus' reckoning, on Nisan 15. Both dates are correct. Let's think about who wrote the Gospel of John. In it, Jesus' last Passover meal is not labeled as such, but as a supper. This also explains how he could write that someone of the disciples would have thought that it could have been possible for Judas to buy something. It would have been impossible to buy anything on the evening of a Passover meal, because shopping was not allowed on a day of rest. On a Sabbath or a day of rest, it was also forbidden to carry loads. So also on the first day of rest of the Passover, on which Jesus was crucified, according to his understanding. Jesus, of course, did not transgress the law of Moses, and so Simon of Cyrene had to carry the cross for Jesus. But the Gospel of John says that Jesus was bearing his own cross. The Greek verb for to carry was occasionally used metaphorically, but I think that this is one of the several minor discrepancies between the Gospels, and that the author assumed that Jesus had to carry his cross himself as a convict, as was common practice at the time. The author of the Gospel of John apparently had no knowledge that Jesus was celebrating the Passover with his disciples, and, according to his understanding, was crucified on the first day of rest of the Passover. This is astonishing because he described the events of this Seder evening in great detail in 5 chapters, beginning with the washing of the feet and ending with Jesus' high priestly prayer. The writer also had very profound revelations, for example, that Jesus is the Word. Further, he explained the Lord's Supper in the way that Jesus' body and blood are to be eaten and drunk. Additionally, we find the 7 I am words in this Gospel. This shows that even if we have very profound revelation from God in some areas, this can only be a partial revelation, and that our brothers and sisters have knowledge of other valuable things. For we only know in part, as Paul was writing. Let's think for a moment about this question. Was the author one of the 12 disciples of Jesus? Well, the 12 were taught directly by Jesus, and they heard him saying, in particular, during the Passover meal, "I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." So they knew directly from Jesus that he died on Nisan 15 according to his understanding. If one of them had later written that he was crucified on Nisan 14, then he would have had to intentionally turn away from Jesus' teaching. He would therefore have had to assume that Jesus was mistaken. This definitely cannot be assumed. I must therefore conclude that the Gospel of John was not written by any of the 12 disciples. Towards the end of the Gospel it is written, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things." The most common view is that this refers to the disciple whom Jesus loved. This supports the idea that this Gospel was written by one of the 12 disciples. But many Bible scholars assume that the last chapter has a different author than the previous ones. This is supported by the fact that the second last chapter already has a closing word. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, and this is similar to the one in the currently last chapter. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Jesus died on Friday, on the 6th day of the week, and after the Sabbath he rose again on the first day, on Sunday, as we may read in all 4 Gospels. According to the prophecies, Jesus was to be dead for 3 days, and he was to rise again on the 3rd day. When doing the math, bear in mind that according to the biblical counting method, parts of days are counted in full. The first day of death is therefore Friday. Jesus lay in the tomb on the Sabbath before he rose from the dead on the first day of the week on Sunday. He was therefore dead for 3 days and rose from the dead on the 3rd day. This counting method can also be found in some other places in the Bible. Queen Esther fasted for 3 days and then went to the king on the 3rd day. The people asked Rehoboam to make the hard service easier, and he told them to come back after 3 days. And then the people returned on the 3rd day. Joseph put his brothers in custody for 3 days, and on the 3rd day he spoke to them and set them free. Jesus had prophesied that he would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish. That is a figure of speech that refers to a period of 3 days, including the nights in between. This becomes clearer when we look at the following scriptures. For 40 days Jesus fasted in the wilderness and was tempted by Satan, as we can read in the Gospels according to Mark and Luke. And these were 40 days and 40 nights, as we read in Matthew. The period of 40 days is therefore exactly the same as that of 40 days and 40 nights. David and his men found an Egyptian man who had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And this was from the time he fell sick 3 days ago. So this is about a period of 3 days. Moses was 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain with God. It would be unrealistic to assume that Moses ascended or descended the mountain at night. So a period of 40 days is meant. Job's friends sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. Here, too, we can assume that they did not come or leave during the night. The addition of 3, 7, or 40 nights is for emphasis. So Jesus was dead 3 days and 3 nights, according to the biblical manner of speaking. And this is by no means inconsistent with the fact that he was only dead for 2 nights, according to our current way of expression. Immediately after the Passover rules, the book of Leviticus provides instructions for the offering of the firstfruits. This sacrifice was to be offered by the priests on the day after the Sabbath. This refers to the weekly Sabbath during the feast of Passover. If the firstfruits had been offered on a later Sabbath, it would have been necessary to return to the temple in Jerusalem, because sacrifices could only be made there. People would have had to travel to the temple 4 times a year and not just 3 times, as it was commanded, because they had to come to the temple for the Passover anyway. On this very day, when the first fruits were offered, Jesus rose from the dead. This is certainly no coincidence, because Jesus was the first to rise from the dead, as we may read in the book of Acts. And, as Paul wrote, Christians who have died will be raised from the dead when Jesus returns. Many Jews believe that the Sabbath, after which the first fruits offering was to be made, is not the weekly Sabbath, but the first day of rest of the Passover on Nisan 15. This is why many people celebrate the day of firstfruits always on the 2nd day of Passover on Nisan 16. The Hebrew word for Sabbath was derived from a verb Shabbath, meaning to rest or to cease from something. There are only 2 exceptions in the entire Old Testament where this does not refer to the weekly Sabbath. First, the Sabbath year, and second, the Day of Atonement, which was to be a Sabbath of solemn rest. In Hebrew, in the context of the Day of Atonement, the word for Sabbath is followed by the noun Shabbaton, which means Sabbath observance. This was also derived from the verb Shabbath. The very same two Hebrew words, Shabbath and Shabbaton, were also used several times to refer to the weekly Sabbath. According to this, the weekly Sabbath is no less holy than the Day of Atonement. The days of rest of the Passover were not labeled as Sabbath in the Bible, so it cannot be assumed that the Sabbath in question refers to one of these 2 days. And if this were the case, then it would have to be assumed that the seventh and not the first day of the Passover was meant, because this is the day of rest mentioned just before the ordinance for the day of Firstfruits, whereas the first day of rest is subject of the preceding verse. It is also evident from an account in the book of Joshua that such interpretations cannot be correct. The Israelites entered the Promised Land and kept the Passover on the evening of Nisan 14, and the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The day after the Passover is Nisan 15, because the Passover is on Nisan 14. And in Numbers 33, verse 3, it is explicitly stated that the day after the Passover is Nisan 15. On this day, the Israelites ate the freshly harvested produce of the land. Please note that they were not allowed to do so before the day of Firstfruits, as written in Leviticus 23, verse 14. So in this year, the day of Firstfruits cannot have been after Nisan 15. Therefore, the practice of celebrating the day of Firstfruits always on the second day of Passover is not in line with biblical scriptures. Jesus appeared to his disciples over a period of 40 days after his resurrection and then ascended to heaven. This was on Thursday, the 5th day of the week. Depending on whether the first month had 29 or 30 days, according to the calendar of the council, Jesus' ascension was on the 25th or 26th of the second month. On Pentecost, the disciples of Jesus and many other believers were filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately after the regulations for offering the first fruits, the book of Leviticus provides instructions for the Feast of Weeks. This feast was to take place 7 weeks after the day of Firstfruits, and again on the first of the week, that is, on the 50th day after the offering of the Firstfruits. When counting the 50 days, the first day is included again, the day of Firstfruits. The English word Pentecost is derived from the Greek word Pentekoste, which means 50th. Depending on the length of the previous 2 months, the feast of Pentecost after Jesus' resurrection was on the 5th, 6th, or 7th of the 3rd month. A few minutes ago I mentioned that it is not in line with the Bible that many Jews always celebrate the second day of Passover as the day of Firstfruits. Consequently, they count the 50 days from this day until the Feast of Weeks. This is the so-called counting of the Omer. Please consider this. There are to be 7 Sabbaths from the day of Firstfruits to the Feast of Weeks. Here the Hebrew word Shabbath was translated exceptionally as week. This translation is questionable. Nowhere in the Old Testament does the Hebrew word for Sabbath mean week. The Greek word in the New Testament for Sabbath is derived from the Hebrew. The Greek word occasionally refers to a week, but always to a period from Sunday to Saturday. That means not to any period of 7 days. But such an arbitrary period of 7 days would have to be meant here by the Hebrew Shabbath in order to be able to count this 7 times until the Feast of Weeks. This is also questionable because there is a Hebrew word which stands for a period of 7 days, which does not have to correspond to a week from Sunday to Saturday. The day of Firstfruits should therefore be celebrated on the day after the weekly Sabbath. Another indication for this comes from the analogy with the year of Jubilee. Every 7 years was a Sabbath year to allow the land to rest. After 7 Sabbath years, in the following 50th year was to be the year of Jubilee. The land should also be at rest this year. The analogy is as follows. The 7 weekly Sabbaths stand for 7 Sabbath years. The Feast of Weeks corresponds to the year of Jubilee, in which the land was to rest again. In addition, the year of Jubilee should follow directly after the 7th Sabbath year. God definitely wanted 2 years of rest immediately after each other, and he especially pointed out that the harvest of the year before would last for 3 years. This strongly supports the argument that people should also rest for 2 days without interruption, particularly on the 7th Sabbath after the day of Firstfruits and the following day, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. 2 days of rest should be a blessing for the people. Unfortunately, some Jews see the Sabbath as a burden because of their own laws that were not given by God. So I suspect that these Jews were looking for an alternative interpretation of the scriptures in order to avoid this as much as possible. The Jewish scribes and teachers of the law had long ago falsified the word of God with their interpretations. Jeremiah already reported that they had made it into a lie. And Jesus also criticized them for not keeping God's commandments, but their own traditions and commandments of men. So it is not surprising at all that some Jews today have a different view. Let's look at the upcoming dates. As I mentioned before, the beginnings of the months are sometimes shifted slightly in the Jewish calendar, which is generally used today. In particular, this avoids the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, falling on the day before or after the weekly Sabbath. The Day of Atonement is a day of rest that should be celebrated on the 10th day of the 7th biblical month. According to the astronomical dates, for example, it falls on Friday, September 29 in the year 2028, and on Sunday, October 10 in the year 2027. By shifting the start of the month, this avoids having to keep 2 days of rest in a row without interruption. So the question arises, if you want to follow the astronomical data or the declarations of the rabbis in Israel. Jesus determined the beginning of the month according to his observation, in other words, according to the astronomical dates, and he did not follow the council. Because I follow Jesus, I also follow the astronomical dates. So sometimes in the following table there's a deviation of 1 day from the Israelite calendar. 2 separate lines again refer to the calendar of the council and of Jesus. I've noted the 3rd day after the crucifixion as the day of Jesus' resurrection, and the 40th day after as Ascension Day. This day of resurrection is not at the day of Firstfruits. Please remember that Jesus rose from the dead on the day of Firstfruits, because in the year of Jesus' crucifixion, both dates fell on the same day. Having seen this, which days should be celebrated on the occasions of the crucifixion or the resurrection? For example, in 2024, there were 3 days that could be celebrated as the day of resurrection, namely April 25, 26 and 28, the day of Firstfruits. And if you do not strictly follow the astronomical data, but the Israelite calendar, then there are even other dates. I think it's a good idea to simply celebrate the biblical feasts, in particular the weekly Sabbaths and the other days of rest, remembering every day what Jesus has accomplished for us. Many Christians today celebrate Easter from Maundy Thursday to Easter Sunday. This custom goes back to the time of Emperor Constantine I, when the date for Easter was set differently from the date for Passover. So Easter is celebrated instead of Passover. This is comparable to Sunday being celebrated today instead of the biblical day of rest, which is the Sabbath. You may read about this in one of my articles. In this table, I've summarized the analogies between God's spring feast and Jesus' ministry. It is remarkable how wonderfully God has arranged all this. It rarely happens that the day of Firstfruits is the 3rd day after the day on which the Passover lambs had to be sacrificed. But God arranged it in this way for the year in which Jesus died. Jesus, our Passover lamb. And in his wisdom, he also arranged the feasts and directed the events in such a way that Jesus celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples and instituted the Lord's Supper, and yet died at the very hour when the other Jews were sacrificing their Passover lambs. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus was crucified on Nisan 14, and according to the other Gospels on Nisan 15. But this is not a contradiction, because according to the calendar of the council, the crucifixion took place on Nisan 14, and according to Jesus' reckoning, it was already Nisan 15, because the month began for Jesus 1 day earlier. It is not important whether this was because God had shown him the new moon 1 evening earlier than the others, or whether there was another reason for Jesus did not follow the declaration of the council. If you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to contact me via my website. Shalom. God bless you.